I'm Rajdeep Assange.
And I'm Ethan.
This is Between Past and Future. Ethan, you want to go ahead and start us out?
Yeah, so we're going to start today with some headlines, interesting things in the news. So Nick Cannon, who has a YouTube talk show called Cannon's Class, started going on basically an anti-Semitic rant. And to first things first, I don't think necessarily that Nick Cannon hates Jewish people, or this is really like proof that Nick Cannon is an anti-Semite. But he started referencing these conspiracy theories that I think have become fairly popular on the internet in various meme forms, and a lot of people don't even realize how anti-Semitic they are. But he mentioned the Rothschilds, centralized banking, the 13 families, the bloodlines that control everything, even outside of America. And he had a former Public Enemy figure, the rap group, Richard Professor Griffin, who was fired from the group after making similar claims in an interview in 1989. And Cannon went on to say, Black people are the true Hebrews, and he praised Louis Farrakhan, and he said, the people who don't have melanin are a little less. When they were sent to the
Oh
mountains
boy.
of Caucasus, the sun the sun then started to deteriorate them. So then they're acting out of fear, they're acting out of low self esteem, they're acting out of a deficiency. So therefore, the only way they can act is evil. They have to rob, steal, rape, kill in order to survive. So then, these people that didn't even have what we have, and when I say we, I speak of the melanated people, they had to be savages. They're acting as animals, so they're the ones that are actually closer to animals. They're the ones that are the true savages. And then, after this, Cannon went on Facebook and made a statement he says I have no hate or in my heart or malice intentions. Actually says I do not condone hate speech. But then he says there's no malice or negative intent. But in a time like 2020, we got to have these conversations. And if that's an assumption that is perceived as ignorant, let's debunk it right away. He said apologies are empty, and I want them. I don't tell my children to say sorry. I want them to understand where they need to be corrected. So he didn't apologize or retract any statements. And then Viacom, that I guess employs him for Teen Nick, they fired him pretty quickly.
Yeah, that makes
But
sense.
those are some pretty crazy statements.
Yeah, some of those are really quite extreme, especially the stuff about the melanated people having some sort of a advantage because of it. Well, that sucks for you, Ethan.
Yeah. I think it's also interesting because this isn't something that Nick Cannon just sat around and thought up one day, right? He's using specific terms like melanated and talking about Caucasus Mountains. And it
Right.
seems like he was reading some bizarre race theory. And there's this bizarre race theory belief on the far left as well that says that there's like a hierarchy and that differences are these essential categories. And so, like, black people
Well, it
have
does
these
sound
categories.
like he you said he cited or praised Farrakhan, right? Some of that stuff
Yeah.
definitely sounds like straight out of Nation of Islam, their cosmology and all that.
Yeah, and I think it comes out of an ignorance because there isn't this, like, if you look into why there's this conspiracy about Jewish world control, it goes back to a time in Europe when anti-Semitism was virulent in the same way that they'd say there's systematic racism today, or there wasn't during slave times or in Jim Crow. And a lot of these myths that come from that time period. So, like when the Rothschilds were a rich banking family and also Jewish, they're still around, and people on the internet, new people, are learning these things. And I think what happens is there isn't a lot of attention paid to anti-Semitism, particularly in young people, and there isn't a lot of debunking that goes on. So people aren't really, if people say something, they're kind of poo-pooed and fired right away instead of actually having a conversation about why they were wrong, why they started to believe this horrible conspiracy.
Right. And so I think that the ignorance is one part of it, and then the other aspect of, especially with the comment about the melanated skin, um, in terms of how it relates to Nation of Islam, it is a reactive sort of mythology in the religious sense of trying to reverse the scientism that was used to promote white supremacy. So they're kind of using like this scientific, materialistic way of saying that actually people who are more colored, more darkly colored, are superior, using sort of scientific language. So it's kind of a strange reversal of things like phrenology and all that.
Yeah, and I think it makes sense for young people who are just going on the internet or just starting to learn about race or racism. If they get a sort of half picture and all they hear is people like Robin DiAngelo going on with her nonsense, they get this weird skewed version of the world where everything is black and white. And so they think, all right,
Oh, that's
the
a
reason
really
why,
dangerous combination. Sort of this white fragility, white guilt idea promoted by people like Robin DiAngelo, and then you mix that in with this sort of scientific understanding of melanin being like this spiritual molecule. That's a recipe for disaster right there.
yeah, and I don't know how common that idea is right now necessarily, but I do remember reading that they were articles about this in fairly popular magazines in the 70s and 80s and maybe 90s. Um, so like, kind of like lifestyle magazines that would have like articles about how to do your hair or sex tips or something would have like kind of like an astrology like theme, like those goofy kind of, I don't even know how you, like spiritualist things. And the
Mm-hmm.
melanin idea was popular for a little bit. And there's studies where there's studies where melanin is thought to have some sort of role in the brain, right? That doesn't necessarily correlate with the melanin that you find in your skin. But if somebody just pulls out a screenshot of a scientific study that says, oh, melanin has some kind of role in your brain, combine all these other things, it's perfectly reasonable that some non hateful, ignorant person would all of a sudden start adopting this hateful rhetoric.
Right. Oh, that's a pretty interesting story. You got anything else on it, or should we move on?
I think that's about it. It'll be interesting to see what happens because I think that it seemed like conservatives kind of quickly rallied about firing him and
Hmm.
or
The
addressing it
flip side of
somehow.
cancel culture.
Yeah, and I think that that's just as bad. And if you're really for free speech, I think the solution is instead of canceling his YouTube show or firing him right away, do what remember Obama had that beer summit, have him sit down with a couple different people and have a talk about it. If he's completely unrepentant and then the bosses say, hey, we really want to fire him, I guess they can fire him. But I think firing him actually does not solve the problem at all. But then
Well, it's a
there's one.
conversation ender, right? Firing him.
Yeah, and if you fire him, he's going to go home and go read the same exact stuff and just fall further into the conspiracy hole. So you're just creating more of a problem, actually.
Oh, there's also even a martyrdom aspect to being canceled, right? It'll be like, oh, I must have hit a nerve and I must have been
Yeah,
speaking some truth, and that's why they wanted to shut me up. So then you can
especially
get more radicalized in that way, in
especially when
whatever
it's the
direction.
media company who's
Right.
firing him, and that's part of this big conspiracy that the media. So even though he's a figure in the media, there's this conspiracy that the media is controlled by either powerful people or Jewish people specifically. And I think that that kind of populist rhetoric accounts for the anti-Semitism to some degree. And there has been a correlation with populism and anti-Semitism in the past. But maybe we should move on a little bit. I have one other headline, and do you hear about this, Raj? The approved statements for the NBA jerseys.
Oh, a little bit. I haven't followed it too much, but I did see. I noticed that Free Hong Kong was not allowed.
Yeah, that's not on the list. So there's as far as I can tell, this is an official approved list at the NBA. I'm not sure how they came up with it exactly, but they have Black Lives Matter, say their names, vote, I can't breathe, justice, peace, equality, freedom, enough, si se puede, liberation,
Enough?
enough, just enough. That's just the word.
Okay.
Um, I'm not reading all of them yet. I'm just going through the
Yeah.
see us, hear us, respect us, love us, listen to us, stand up, anti-racist. I am a man. Speak up. How many more? Group economics, education reform, and mentor.
It's strange that a word like enough or mentor or can get politicized. I don't necessarily, I'm
Yeah,
not necessarily a fan of that.
yeah. It seems like, I mean, I don't think there's anything wrong with any of these statements at all. But having an approved list of that the NBA came up with that you're allowed to put on your jersey seems to kind of take the point of putting a statement on your jersey in the first place away, right? And
Yeah.
a couple of them are just odd, like group economics. That's like, I guess, conveys some sort of point that like economics are important to equality, but it's just like a weird, clunky like HR phrase.
Yeah.
Um, yeah,
Yeah,
and
it's gonna
it's
get really good when someone's dunking though, and the back of their jersey says group economics.
yeah. I wonder if there's going to be any rebels because who try to put something else on their jersey. What if they have like tape on letters and they can change their statements
Yeah,
in and out of the
or like,
quarter
just like take off a couple of the letters so it says something else, like Bart Simpson style.
instead of freedom, just Dom.
Yeah. uh, all right, I got a headline for you. Um,
Oh, instead of anti-racist, just racist.
Turkey, they are attempting to cover the Christian icons in the Hagia Sophia, and they're trying to turn it back into a functioning mosque. It's
Aren't they
been,
going to? They're just covering them for the mosque services, though, right?
I believe so. So it's in 1934, Ataturk, the president of Turkey at the time, declared that the Hagia Sophia is going to be a museum. And now Erdogan is trying to change that. They're trying to say that turning it into a museum was unlawful in the first place. And now they want to start holding, they want to turn it more into a functioning mosque and start having prayers inside of it. They want to do this within, I think, in about 2 weeks. So this is a developing story that'll be more information will be coming out over the next couple of weeks.
Yeah, so I read about that, and at first it seemed kind of odd, but then I don't know. It seems like they could do this and it wouldn't really affect anything. So from the statement I heard, they were claiming that by doing this and turning into their mosque, it would be the same welcoming tourist environment outside of the services, and that mosques are open to anyone, regardless of faith or race or sex. So turning it into a mosque wouldn't create any sort of exclusionary environment. I don't really know too much about it, but if that's true and they're just covering the icons temporarily with like little, maybe they'll have like a little remote control curtain that'll like zip in and out. I
Yeah,
don't know.
they
Is
want
that
to
really a
cover it with
problem?
curtains or lasers. I don't know what that means, but
Oh, I heard the laser thing. That sounds really interesting. I kind of want to see that idea.
yeah, I think they're gonna just like put a bunch of light all over it, which will be kind of odd. But yeah, the rest of the time outside of prayer times, it will be open to all visitors, and admission is still going to be free of charge. And they'll uncover the Christian icons. I think it is a worrisome first step to some Christians, though, right? Like they're worried about sort of the slippery slope this could lead down.
Yeah, and it was originally built as a Christian church,
Right. It
and
was
then
originally erected by the Byzantines in like 800. And then the Ottomans came in, and after Byzantine Empire fell, Ottoman Empire came and took it over, and it was a mosque for a very long time. After that, for a couple hundred, 300 years or so, then the Turkish Revolution happened. Erdogan and all of his young Turks secularist came in, and then they turned it into a museum.
yeah, it does though seem to be not unconnected to Turkey's kind of slow shift to the far right and to being less secular, because I think there was a trend to becoming more secular and more Western or liberal when they
Oh yeah, in the
were
early
trying to get into the
2000s.
EU.
Yeah, in the early 2000s, Erdogan was really pushing trying to get into the EU. Um, but since the last 10 years or so, in this decade, the position has definitely shifted more towards Islamist attitudes relating to politics. And there's been, crackdowns on journalists within Turkey. They have started persecuting Islamic groups such as the Hizmet movement, which is kind of a reformist group. It's not really considered much of a. They're definitely Muslims, but some people look at them side-eyed. And Erdogan attempted to place blame on the coup back in 2013 on them, and a bunch of them have been taken in as political prisoners. So, Turkey's kind of a very odd spot with a lot of volatility.
Yeah, that seems like it's definitely a volatile situation. And Turkey's been kind of at the center of various cultural shifts for most of history, right?
Yeah, in some ways, right? It's this sort of gateway between Europe and Asia. There's really big. It played some sort of role in the Cold War with relation to placing missiles there and stuff like that. But
Even going back, the historical city of Troy was in modern day Turkey.
yeah.
Um, well, I have one more little intro segment. An interesting meme I saw the other day. I
Mm.
might be another interesting meme, but I have one right here, and it's a hundred things for white people to know about racism. One of these lists, and number 69. And I think, on some level, I start to think sometimes people are getting trolled or like infiltrated or something, because number 69 on the 100 item list is, it's never useful to say stuff like, but what about the white working class? Have you thought about the non-white working class people's needs? So partially this makes sense, because if you have a conversation about racism and someone says, oh, well, there's poor white people. Okay, well, just because there's also poor white people doesn't mean that racism isn't a problem, right? But a lot of ways that you could try to fix racism or alleviate the problems of racism in the black community also go along with regular working class concerns. And there seems almost to be an accidental or purposeful kind of movement to label working class as white. So, say the white working class. And I don't know if this is accidental as some sort of rhetorical tool, or maybe people are being trolled and to look foolish. But I've seen a couple of these sort of memes going around, and yeah, I don't know. It seems like a pretty dangerous idea.
Yeah, that doesn't. It is certainly a way of undermining solidarity between various working class people.
And then also one last point about that MBA Jersey thing. So I googled the term group economics just to see what would come up, and interestingly enough, right away the like first couple suggested Google things were group economics MBA. But one article that came up somewhere in the top couple articles, it advocated for black people starting businesses and investing in black communities, etc. But then it also said that they should hire black people, and which there's nothing wrong with that, right? But the way it was worded almost suggested that they should advertise uh, in a racial way that would technically be illegal. And I don't know if this is another example of just uncareful reasoning, but it almost seems like people are kind of being trolled right now, right, into saying kind of foolish things. Um, and
Yeah, but I guess the question is, to what end is this trolling happening? Is it just for the sake of trolling? Because this kind of seems a little more nefarious, right? Like this seems like something that people in power, like this seems like it would be advantageous to corporations and things like that. This kind of trolling.
I don't know if it's necessarily it's advantageous to corporations so much as that, well, it could be either A, when you get into such a bubble, you just start to say more and more radical things, right? There's like an
Right.
echo chamber trying to shout over each other, and eventually people also aren't really actually thinking too much. They're just kind of reacting. And with this meme culture where people share these images with a couple words and a caption going around, people are just speaking in meme talk almost a lot of times. And I think that leads to stereotyping and bias and these weird type of ideas. It could also be that there's some like people behind the scenes or who are working and writing these things who have some sort of nefarious end, right? And they want to trick these people into saying things that make them look stupid. But I don't know if that seems unlikely. It seems like it would require a lot of work, and I don't know if
Right. No one's
that really makes sense.
the nefarious version of it requires a lot of resources, and it doesn't seem like too many people are going to be interested in spending those resources.
Yeah, and like I looked up the person who wrote that 100 number list, and it was an interesting story. They were like biracial and had a bunch of articles about being light skinned and that sort of experience, and they went to school in England and Sweden. So reading it, I just assumed it was an American person. So then it turned out it was someone from England who also went to school in Sweden. But anyway, I guess we should move on to maybe take a quick break and then move on to the CHAZ CHOP stuff.
Sounds good. We'll be back. Optimism by Danielle Chapman. I made a fascinating box, then I broke some boxes down. I smashed them into boxed juice. Then I pulled over at the ocean hall to see what monsters might rise up within its watery walls. Of course it would be the sea dragon's oscillating galleon sails, delicate as scallion skins through cylinders of glycerin. Of course such a wonder is always off to war with the darkness that surrounds even aquariums that graze in pains and says, "This is going to keep happening." Yes, death will make the poem end, but we'll drive on listening to unloosed color pencils roll out of plastic grills, not unlike gills, into crummy holes waggling seatbelt buckles, which I'll vacuum one day when I'm truly old, and the sea dragons. Then the drawing of sea dragons have sailed back into their stalls.
So we're back with an addendum to our previous episode where we talked about Nick Cannon. Later that same day, and the next day, he actually did end up issuing an apology. He offered his most deepest and sincere apologies to the Jewish community for hurtful and divisive words. He said that he reinforced the worst stereotypes of a proud and magnificent people, and I feel ashamed of the uninformed and naive place that these words came from. So he was fired from Viacom CBS, which as of now is held up. But then Fox issued a statement saying that in light of his apology, he would remain host. And he also spoke with a rabbi whose name is Abraham Cooper. He's the associate dean of the Simon Wiesenthal Center. So this is an update. Before, at first, he was unrepentant, and there were some people who supported him. And then after this, even the radio personality Charlemagne the God, he I don't know the exact text of his statement. I don't think it's that important, but he pretty much offered support for Nick Cannon and said something to the effect of, "This is proof that Jewish people are in power in the media." So that's just a little update.
It's the interesting thing about it is that it does seem to follow the same pattern as other cancelings, where someone will state their opinion, they'll be pushed back, they'll become educated, and then they'll apologize for the things that they said.
Yeah, and I think that this is well. So I think this kind of highlights in a little bit of way like why I think cancel culture is not exactly the best term, because in this case it seems like he said something that's just completely indefensible and can be proven to be related to anti-Semitic stereotypes. This quote unquote scholarship he was talking about is just racist anti-Semitic nonsense. And he was almost given more of a chance than some people, but it isn't necessarily canceling people. Even if they had fired him from both jobs, he would still have a platform. He can be on Twitter or Facebook or whatever. It's more kind of establishing guidelines about what you can or can't say in the public space. And in this case, I think almost everyone would agree that that's not something you should say. But in a way, I'm kind of glad Nick Cannon said it because he thought those things. And now that he said those things out loud, there's a debate, and hopefully reason wins over racism. But I think some people aren't really given that chance, or there's even sort of like a hesitancy to talk about things. to talk about someone, that could, like, people don't want to acknowledge that someone could be prejudiced and not necessarily a bad person. Maybe almost because it makes it obvious that anyone could be prejudiced at any time, no matter how good you think you are.
I guess this this kind of highlights a danger, a different danger about cancel culture that I hadn't realized before, and that is there might be some statements which people deserve to be reprimanded for, and cancel culture takes that stance to an extreme, and it's kind of a boy who cried wolf scenario. It didn't happen in this case, but I could see in the future people becoming immune to any sort of um, disciplinary action because they voiced opinions that aren't necessarily true, or they're offensive, or they lead to a dangerous road.
So you said they're immune to criticism?
I'm saying that like right now cancel culture is in full swing. I could see in the future the public becoming sort of desensitized to it, and in becoming desensitized to cancel culture, and let's say people stop caring about it, it could lead to a very negative outcome, right? Where people start saying actually hateful things, and there could be a sort of an apathy about it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I don't think that's happened yet, but I did see these sort of memes going around saying, "Oh, cancel culture is actually an aspect of this white fragility concept," where, and several other memes kind of saying that if you I can't think of a specific example. Oh, they're saying, like, we never asked for cartoon voices to be canceled or for street names to be changed. We just wanted so and so's killers to be arrested and held accountable. So there's a little bit of pushback, I think, already to this, like, cancel people, fire them, issue a tweet where you're shocked and appalled at whoever said who or whoever said what. But yeah, eventually people are just going to stop caring. And I mean, to some degree, that's probably better, that people don't really care too much what some people say in private. But if you're like, a newscaster, a media personality, openly saying hateful things, there should be some sort of pushback or questioning or criticism.
Yeah. All right, cool. Thanks for that update.
All right, yeah, just a little, because it happened. So we were reporting on the issue basically as it happened, and then he did issue an apology pretty quick, so we should probably add that in there. And
Yeah.
if Nick Cannon hears this and wants to come on the show, perfectly welcome.
Oh yeah. We're down to have you on, Nick Cannon.
All right, well, this will be spliced in somewhere between the intro and the Seattle ChOP episode.
Yeah.
All right.
All right.
Go to break.
Threat Landscape by Ray Armentrout. 1. Life began with general irritability, then developed lateral suppression, the ability to boost subsignals while tamping others down. Attention. Creating a high-contrast world with exaggerated peaks and troughs, the threat landscape projected now on screens by paid experts. 2. You're right, Sasha. I forgot. The butterflies are frightening with their abrupt approaches and batty swerves. They mix the outside in. You're right. We don't know what will happen.
So we're back, and now we're going to talk about CHAZ, CHOP, the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, or the Capitol Hill Organized Protest, depending on whatever acronym you want to use. This was the area in Seattle, which near the East Precinct, which is police office. Basically, what happened was a bunch of protesters who went out on the streets in response to the George Floyd killing ended up taking control of an area of Capitol Hill, a very left-leaning neighborhood in Seattle. Lots of LGBTQ plus people live around there. Lots of sort of far left thinking happens in that area. But so they took over an area. The city decided to relinquish control of the East Precinct in order to de-escalate tensions between protesters and police officers. And we're going to dig into that, and I'm going to just go over a brief timeline. That way we have a sort of an overview of the events. So on May 29th, protest and police response began to become very antagonistic with each other and aggressive. The 29th is the earliest that the police talk about seeing protesters breaking windows of like grocery stores, Amazon pickup centers, convention centers, homes. Rocks and fireworks were being thrown at officers, including some reports say that rocks the size of basketballs were being thrown at police. Police cars were smashed up, their windows, and the King County Children and Family Justice Center was, some of their windows got smashed up. On May 30th, you have the day of the most arrests in Seattle in relationship to the protest. So 55 people were arrested. Charges included assault on an officer, obstruction, assault, burglary, and failure to disperse. A lot of the failure to disperse charges were dropped in the following weeks. Officers were being injured. Several of them were required treatment at the hospital, and this is in between the 29th to about the 5th of June when things started to de-escalate. On the 6th of June, however, things started back up. 5 officers were injured, and the 7th of June is sort of when CHAZ, CHOP starts to come into play. In the Capitol Hill area, a man drove his car into protesters, and a 27-year-old black man reached into the man's car to try and get at the steering wheel, and the driver shot the 27-year-old named Daniel in the arm. We've got a link of Daniel walking down the street talking about what happened. He made a full recovery, and the cops picked up the driver of the car a few days later. June 8th, the city decides to make the city made the decision to get rid of to relinquish control of the East Precinct because that's where a lot of antagonism was happening. So they removed some barricades around the area, and they boarded up the windows, and the police got out of the area. So June 9th is when the protesters start building up CHAZ, CHOP. I'm going to read a few direct quotes from the official timeline from the mayor's office. The mayor's name is Durkan. We'll be talking more about her throughout this whole segment. So June 9th, 2020, demonstrations shifted to peaceful gatherings, including daily teach-ins on racial and social justice, concerts, the formation of a community garden, and community gatherings with evening movies and potlucks. From June 9th to June 19th, thousands of demonstrators and tourists visited Capitol Hill, engaging in mostly peaceful demonstrations. SPU, Seattle Parks Utilities, provided water and sanitation service to the park, and Seattle Department of Transportation worked to ensure there was both safe space for protesters while upgrading barricades and other facilities to provide necessary access for businesses, residents, and essential city services. The Parks Department continued to collect garbage on site and ensure the facility was lit through the night to improve safety. So in the initial days, CHAZ was actually the police were voluntarily withdrawn, and the CHAZ was receiving some form of city support. However, on the evening on June 20th, we had the first incidents of firearm violence with multiple victims. One was a teenager who was shot and killed, and another was an individual who was shot and critically injured. On June 21st, the very next day, another teenager was shot. In response to this, the city deployed Black-led organizations and trusted community partners to help de-escalate violence occurring in and around the site. On June 22nd, a second incident involving firearm violence injured 2 additional individuals. So in the span of 3 days, you have 3 You have, in the span of 3 days, 5 people were injured because of firearms. Then you have a few more days where on the 22nd and the 23rd, the city is trying to figure out what to do. And on the evening of the 23rd, a man in his 30s was shot and transported to Harborview Medical Center. And the city is still scrambling, trying to figure out what to do. On June 26th, the Mayor Durkin met with demonstrators to inform that the situation had become too dangerous and strongly urged them to leave for the safety of demonstrators, residents, and employees of the surrounding businesses. And then on June 29th, a juvenile was shot and killed, and another juvenile was critically injured in this area. And then June 30th, Mayor Durkheim signed an executive order, and June 1st, at around 5 a.m., the SPD came in to clear up CHAZ, CHOP, and that was kind of the end of the occupation. So that's that's a large overview of what happened in Seattle from May 29th to July 1st. And yeah.
So it seems like it seems like it escalated pretty quickly, and then also de-escalated almost as quickly. Like it seemed like for a second that it would be hard to imagine the police going in and tearing it up, or the mayor, saying no to the protesters because they already abandoned the police precinct. But then after the violence escalated, a lot of people, like I saw one video where they're talking to a guy who's very oddly dressed, seems like some sort of goofy character. He had like a big wool coat on and then shorts and flip-flops and an odd hat. And he said he lived in the zone and that he had been very supportive at first, and at first it was great. And then he was kind of shaking his head and looking out into the distance like he was shell-shocked. He's like, oh my God, I can't believe this happened. Yeah, it seems like people almost kind of gave up, right?
Yeah, well, it seemed like once the first incident happened, it was just this cascading effect where incident after incident started occurring day after day. All of these things happen at night. There was lots of drinking and drug use going on in this area, particularly at night. So that's one of the issues here. And we haven't even gotten into the idea or talked about the fact that there were armed protesters patrolling the area, acting as sort of makeshift police officers.
Yeah, I actually have, where's the quote? So, it says there's a man with blonde-tipped dreadlocks and a Friends t-shirt standing on a concrete block in front of the precinct speaking into a microphone. He swept his arm across a smattering of people. Now, I can count everyone. We need black leadership. We need white bodies. For white people, it's easy to get a gun. Get it and tell them if they keep killing black people, it'll be war. So he's encouraging people to bring guns to the CHAZ zone to protect them against, I think, the cops, but he's unclear. But it said the protest shrunk to hardcore activists, reporters, security, medics, and cooks for the protests, along with teams of heavily armed and high-threat private protection for businesses and residents. So it was definitely seems violent and kind of chaotic place.
Yeah, so there's like two kind of versions of CHAZ CHOP. I recommend that our listeners go ahead and check out the Seattle Times article, Through Many Moods and Fast Changing Times, Seattle CHOP Refines Its Purpose. That was written after the first incidents of violence, I believe. And it really talks about all the different mindsets that were present at CHAZ CHOP. And so there's some people during the day, it really did seem to have this feeling of being a block party, of being kind of an arts fair. People were talking about, lots of people were creating art during the day, and they were creating community gardens and talking about no-till styles of gardening. And there was this very kind of hippie granola vibe to it during the day. But then sometime in the transition into the night, that hippie granola thing kind of lost its power over the space, and this more aggressive aspect of the people who were there seemed to have louder voices.
Yeah, and there's just a common thing, like the same thing that happened with Occupy Wall Street, where when you have free food and a place where you can safely sleep outside, it's going to attract homeless people. And because of the way Seattle developed, which brought a lot of these younger white progressives to Seattle, uh, created a homelessness problem with the rising real estate and housing costs, right? So you
Seattle has
have,
a huge homeless problem.
yeah, and if you also have either generous welfare programs or the perception of generous welfare programs in a safer place, people who are more friendly to the homeless. If progressives are generally more friendly to the homeless, so if you're homeless, you might want to live near those people and not people who harass you or might even attack you. So that various reasons attracts a big homeless population, but that seems to go along with this younger white progressive gentrification model. There's a similar situation in San Francisco. And so I don't think it's entirely disconnected that the protests devolved into this anarchy and homelessness thing, because these same people who encouraged the CHOP zone, they also created a homelessness problem.
Yeah, the homeless issue is really complicated up in Seattle. What with the high tech jobs that are in the area, and all sorts of stuff like that. But this is something Seattle's been struggling with, particularly in its current form for about the last 10 years. And lots of homeless people were drawn to CHAZ. I've seen quotes of homeless people saying they came there to, get some free supplies and things like that. And when the violence started happening, the city started providing hotel vouchers and shelter vouchers for homeless people in the CHAZ CHOP area. So there was a effort to get homeless people, to get them into a new area, to get them some shelter. And there's a lot of concern for those people, but that also brings in a sort of chaotic element, right? Which, especially with the drug use and all that, that creates issues when things get out of hand at night.
Yeah, and that also leads into the shooting incident that really was the death knell for the CHOP zone, where I don't really think it's important to. I think they did. I think the name did become public, but I don't think it's important to really say the name. But there was a um, young man from San Diego, and I just won't say his name, but he's a young man from San Diego, and he was drawn by the protests, and specifically the CHOP takeover. And 5 days before the shooting, he took some money from his dad, wrote a note, and took off. And he's 14. The family doesn't know how he got there. He's a normal kid, got into trouble sometimes, played pranks or whatever.
This
And
was the last incident, correct?
yeah, this was
Yeah.
the car shooting. And so he disappears. Next thing anybody knows, he was shot dead in a car. And the car was stolen from a man who claims that somebody came up. He says they came up and hit him with an ice pack, or an ice pick, like
Mm, yeah.
a big metal ice pick. And he, out of fear, didn't have money on him. He said, "Here, take my car keys. I have a big truck, SUV." And next thing you know, it's seen driving around a baseball park in a field where people had kind of taken over as part of the CHAZ CHOP zone. And so people started a rumor that there was somebody shooting from the car. It's possible that maybe somebody was shooting from the car and then the teenagers got into the car later after that. But it seems likely that fear and panic. There's a constant fear that far right militia people or alt right racists would come and try to attack them. So they thought that they were under attack. And when the car reappeared later and hit a barrier, which seemed likely that they were just kids who didn't know how to drive their stolen car,
Yeah, it was a
everyone
14
started
and
opening
16 year
fire.
old, right?
Yeah, so two
Yeah.
teenagers. And people just started opening fire. There's a video where somebody went up to the car right after this, probably about 20, 30 minutes after, and somebody was laughing and saying, "Oh, I didn't mean to stop shooting. I just ran out of bullets. So they
Yeah.
just wantonly opened fire, emptied clips of who knows what kind of bullets into this car. It was completely like there's blood all over the inside of the car. The
And they
windshield
pick
was
up the
shot
bullet
out.
casings.
Yeah, they said pick up the bullet casings. No evidence. And there was some people. The guy who was filming, he was an African American guy, black guy, who was initially, they were trying not to let him near the site, saying it was too dangerous. And he was like, I'm trying to record it. I'm trying to show people what's going on. And they were trying not to let him through. He eventually just goes through anyway. And he seemed to be genuinely just trying to figure out what was going on. And so he was kind of interviewing people. And one guy came up who had blood on his arm. And he started talking in like almost faux, like military cop speak, like something you'd hear on CSI or NCIS, and he's like, "There's an active shooter incident, blah blah blah. We took him down, and then we turned him over to people to get them medical attention." But he seemed almost gleeful over what happened, and he said something to the effect of, "They got what they deserved. Like we did our job, what we were supposed to do." So
Jeez.
yeah, even initially there was like after this, there wasn't any sort of second guessing. They were just right away proud of what they'd done, and it turns out that the 14-year-old kid died. So, and that seemed to be a pretty hard pill to swallow for the CHAZ CHOP zone to resulted in the death of 2 people of color. In
Yes.
only, how many days was it?
But over the course of about a week and a half. So about, what, 7 to 10 days, I think all this happened.
Yeah, so maybe I'll try to pull up, if I can in the background, a quick approximation of what the murder rate would be for the CHAZ CHOP zone
The
compared to
first one, the first died on the 20th, and the second killing happened on the 29th. So within a period of 9 days. 2 people were killed and 5 people were shot, including the 2 dead, in a period of 9 days. I want to talk about someone who's kind of a periphery character. His name is Andre Taylor. Andre Taylor was somewhat involved. He was not a CHAZ CHOP organizer by any means, but he did talk to some of the people in there. He went in and visited. I bring him up because he's the founder of an organization called Not This Time. And Taylor has been pursuing police reform since about 2017 after his brother was shot and killed by the police. And on the 1st of July, after the police went in to take down CHOP, Andre was speaking to King 5 News, a local news outlet up in the Western Washington, and he said that he was sorry that CHOP had become a missed opportunity, a place that will only be remembered for where 2 people died. He also suggested that CHOP occupiers should have pivoted and reacted as strongly to the killings within CHOP as they did the George Floyd killing, which I thought was a pretty interesting observation. And he was disappointed in what became of CHOP, especially because he's worked very hard to institute police reform in Washington State. He was instrumental in the passage of a bill called I-940, and this bill meant that Washington became the first state in the nation to pass a police training and accountability measure. So he's someone who's actually affected a lot of real change to how police policy gets written in Washington State. And for him to come out and talk about what a missed opportunity the CHOP zone ended up becoming, I think really speaks volumes to this whole situation.
Yeah, and it does. At the end of the day, it just makes the Black Lives Matter movement, the whole reform, larger project of the progressive left, look bad, because now there's an example of failure they can point to, and the conservatives or other enemies could point to, and the first thing that they did when they tried to take control of something was put up borders and get armed guards.
Yep.
And it quickly just turned into worse chaos and much worse problems. So I did a quick, rough calculation, and it seems like if just regardless of what the population of CHAZ was, if for the whole city of Seattle, that would mean the murder rate was 4 times higher than usual and would be in line with Chicago, instead of Seattle, which had a murder rate of about 5 murders per 100,000 people. And if not even accounting for just that it was a small section of Seattle, that would mean the murder rate would jump to 20. So they created a small, chaotic, anarchic society where 2 people of color were killed, and there's gunfire, people were fighting, the people felt unsafe. And I don't think anyone who lived in that area, or most of the people who initially started the project, liked the way it turned out. I don't think that they wanted to live there anymore.
No, there was a mass exodus, I guess you could say. The place was, it had hundreds, close to thousands of there were probably thousands of people there during the peak time, but when the police went in to clear it out, there was only dozens of people remaining, less than 100 people. So I think most of the people involved saw the writing on the walls and wanted to get out of there. I want to go back to this Seattle Times article I was talking about. Through many moods and fast-changing times, Seattle CHOP refines its purpose. And I wanted to provide a few quotes about sort of the diversity of opinion within CHAZ CHOP. So there was one person, Jaden Grayson, who was a CHAZ organizer. She was giving lots of speeches and stuff like that. And this is something I got interested in, where she said, so when you come into this space, understand that you're now walking in holy land. This is spiritual. And Seattle Times reported that the crowd roared in response to this. And I do think that that's a really interesting thing that's going on here. These people are hungry for some sort of spiritual endeavor. And I think that there's plenty of ways to pursue a spiritual endeavor, which doesn't involve creating an autonomous zone and, that devolves into violence. But a few other quotes I want to talk about. A young woman named Keely said, "I don't feel like a black woman in this space. It's not the first thing people notice about me. I'm the woman who's always in the cafe, not the black girl on the couch. That's what black people want, to be seen for who they are." So that seems like a pretty positive take on CHAZ. And then on the flip side, though, you have Grayson saying, "White allies have good intentions, but this space, CHAZ, is oozing with white saviorism. This needs to be focused on education almost completely, with 24/7 opportunities so people can focus on the movement and awareness of just how deep this racism is. Black people are exhausted. CHOP is a majority white body, and it can be scary for black people to be in that space. And I don't think black people need to show up. This is a white issue. This is a white problem." So even within these two quotes, you see the sort of two different ways in which people are interpreting this CHOP CHAZ space. One young black woman, is saying she's never felt more accepted in her life, and this other black woman is saying that it's scary to be black in the CHAZ CHOP space because most of the people here are white. So this whole area just kind of oozes contradiction and chaos, and it to me it really does speak to the need for order conversations and trying to figure out how to operate society.
I think to some degree, the people who are starting this CHAZ CHOP zone and these sort of like almost stereotypical liberal hippie type characters who they're not even just gardening, they're not even just urban gardening, but they're no-till urban gardening, right? And
Right.
sure, growing a lot of kale, but they're probably some of the most tolerant, least racist white people in the entire world. And of course, I think that doesn't mean that there isn't going to be awkward things or weird microaggressions, or that black people are not going to feel uncomfortable ever around them. But it seems kind of like that first quote where that people are genuinely trying, and if you kind of just try to look at people as people and chill out, that's what black people want. They don't want this constant kneeling down, raising your fist, apologizing for racism all the time. Just calm down. But then other people, and I think a lot of times it's white people, are calling for this like cathartic self-flagellation act, and they want to cancel so and so. They want to. Um, I don't even know what this idea about like white spaces. I don't know. Like they're saying if a space is primarily white, they need to undergo some sort of like electroshock treatment so that they're not accidentally racist to a black person. But then black people will feel uncomfortable. So it seems almost what they're saying is that they want segregation, because otherwise I don't see how you could solve that problem.
Right, because the work of becoming an anti-racist and expelling racism out of your psyche is a lifelong endeavor which you might never be clear of, according to Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility.
And not even just her. I mean, normally I wouldn't pick on someone so much, but her book really is that awful. But
Well,
there's
I think it's a
this
good
larger white savior, white guilt complex going on.
right. Well, I think her book kind of encapsulates that feeling that we've seen in lots of places, right?
Yeah, and it's a lot of times too just looked at completely uncritically. Like there's tons and tons of glowing reviews of this book, and people are assigned it for work. Like especially if you work for a nonprofit or for any group that deals with social issues. I saw this handout that was assigned to people who work at a charity group, and it had this same sort of nonsense about like here are some examples of things that are uh, what's the word, like sub. I can't even think of the language they use. It's like aspects of white culture that you didn't realize were white culture, and you might want to think critically about. You know, those kind of lists. Like, did you know that not everyone in the world eats eggs and bacon for breakfast? So,
Mm.
if you're planning a breakfast meeting with people from other cultures, you might want to think about having, Belgian waffles. I don't know, one of those sort of things. But the list of topics was just completely stupid. One of them was hard work ethic. One of them was like showing up on time. Um, like meritocracy, like just these various vague, generic concepts. Say yes, those are aspects of some things that white people believe. But if you look at any culture on earth, there are people who believe in those things. Like, and it's created this weird sort of neo-segregationist idea where it's like black and white people, like the black woman saying quite clearly, I feel comfortable because I'm not being seen as a black person, but as an individual person, someone who is at the cafe rather than the black woman at the cafe. And then you have a whole other group of people who are saying your cultures are so different that you don't overlap. I don't know if I'm making sense, but it seems completely at odds with what people actually want.
Well, see, that's it's making sense. It's a little tangled, but that's okay. Um, there is this strange dichotomy, right? I think there are people who want to, within the progressive left, I think there are people who want to be seen as individuals and kind of are hoping for a future where not necessarily color blindness, but where race isn't the primary identity by which you're identified. And then you have other people on the progressive left who think it is simply impossible to get away from race. And if it's impossible to get away from race, then there needs to be some sort of um, space for white bodies and space for black bodies, which just sounds, it's neo-segregationism as far as I can tell.
Yeah, and there's also there's this idea that it's somehow I don't know why they do it, but they say black and brown or white bodies, and to me this language sounds very creepy and almost dehumanizing.
Yeah, it's this
Uh,
emphasis on the body rather than the person.
yeah, and I mean, I guess it makes sense. I think what some people, it seems like one of those critical theory things, right, where they make something sound awkward or unusual to draw more attention to it.
Mm.
Um, and I think it's intended to sound jarring, but what it really kind of does is dehumanize people. So they say is uh, this space is centered around white bodies and has no room for black and brown bodies. And it kind of just sounds like, oh man, that sounds real bad. We should probably fix it, right? Right, Chip? And then if you said this is a space for white people and not a space for black people, it's centered on white people, be like, well, actually, I don't think that's true, because that's an actual sensible, like that you can make sense of that very quickly. But if you
Right.
said this Wendy's is a white heteronormative cultural institution that's centered around advancing white bodies and harming the black body, people have no idea what you're talking about, but it sounds real bad, and you're definitely gonna be like, maybe I shouldn't go to Wendy's. It sounds like there's something bad going on there. But
Well,
if
I
you
think.
say,
I wanted to jump in. What you were talking about, you kind of give a generous reading of this use of the word body, as it being jarring. So maybe you're paying more attention and you're thinking about it, thinking about what you're reading in a more um, engaged way. But I think sort of the cynical reading of that is that these people, this ideology that is hiding in the progressive left. I wouldn't say that this is an ideology that is the. I don't think it's what the entire progressive left is, right? I think it's a subsection of the progressive left. I think they use the word body because they don't believe in people. Like this is a type of ideology that really devalues the place of agency in a human being's life. So I think that um, the less generous reading is that these people don't believe in people acting in the world. Rather, they think about people as bodies being acted upon by various systems and institutions. Does that
yeah,
make
and
sense?
it's weird too, because in the background there's also a pseudo mystical sort of spirituality going on with this whole thing, right? Where
Right. And the
they're
lady who said the thing about the black bodies, that's the same Grayson who was making the point that this is a spiritual experience.
yeah, and there's a simultaneous like materialist reduction of people to these bodies that are acted upon by social forces and by various, and I mean, no wonder people turn into conspiracy theorists if you believe that people are just completely at the will of powerful forces beyond your control.
Right.
But then there's also this idea of like some sort of mystical otherworldly rightness, like moral superiority, that's not like, it's not based on like cultural supremacy, right? It's just sort of based on this idea that they're right because of history or because it's 2020, something like that, some vague platitude. um, and that allows it to be sort of amorphous and turn into this like an ideology, a really dangerous, powerful ideology. It's combines this materialist, almost capitalist way of viewing the world, where everyone's just a body with a dollar sign, and if someone gets killed, you can pay out their family a bunch of money, and that fixes it, or something like that. And to fix racism, white people just need to pay reparations to black people, and they need to Venmo their friends $5. And then this also spiritual framework that allows people to believe any number of crazy things based on no evidence whatsoever, right? They're saying the Jews are controlling the world, and you don't need any evidence. You can just make these vague statements.
Yeah.
There's also like there's a lot of talk of people like they, the corporations, the media.
The
Um,
imperial they.
yeah, um, just yeah, this imposing imperial day that's in the background doing stuff, and it makes sense to some degree because there are large corporations that are caught over and over again abusing customers. Like there's some cancer causing thing in your heartburn medication. Your baby powder has some radioactive whatever in it. So and so media company, Sinclair Media Company, has been buying all of the television networks and telling their broadcasters to say the same creepy line about global warming. So there are definitely powerful people who control things, but the unnamed they, and even if it is true, just believing in this sort of pseudo mystical thing where you don't actually connect it to real facts, it's based on belief. Like a lot of times, people who are believing conspiracy theories say, like, I believed it strongly, like I knew it to be true before, and then I saw the evidence, and then I knew for sure. Like it's based on some sort of belief, not on actual rational thought.
Right, and I think this is one of the issues with this sort of spiritual framework when it's divorced from something like a traditional religion. These people are experiencing, they won't talk about it this way, but there's like some aspect of revelation that they feel is going on with them. And it's revelation based off of like what they perceive to be the moral arc of history, the revelation about how things should be because it's the current year. But this isn't tied to, like, at least with a religion, most of the time that sort of thing is tied to a text, right? And there's this framework where other people within the religion can
And
sort
now they
of.
do almost have a text, several texts, though, right? Like, I think we talked about this before, the idea of anti-racism or woke ideology, whatever you call it, becoming like a religion. And one part is, like you just said, the revelation, the revealed truth, but then also that certain texts become like symbolic.
But with the religion, right? Like with the more traditional thing, you have a text which you can sort of interpret revelation through, and you have other people in the community who can cross check or come to understand your revelation. And here in this sort of ideology, there might be text emerging like white fragility, but it's not nearly as developed as something like a traditional religion. You have people who will just say things, and you kind of have to take it on faith and snap your fingers along because they said the right thing, right?
Yeah, you're not actually thinking through it, and like the concept, the like broad general idea is that the Enlightenment was about the, what's it called, like that rational thought won over revealed thought, right? So the idea that you learn something and think about it and then believe it versus someone just tells you what to believe. And they seem to be reverting to that almost an anti-liberal or anti-modern perspective where someone with authority who knows something because of their experience tells you and you believe it without thinking about it. And then not thinking about it is almost important because someone, your thoughts and what you think is actually bad and wrong. But
Right.
the
Because you haven't
Enlightenment is,
expunged yourself of the sin of white guilt or whatever.
yeah. And personally, I don't think there's anything really intrinsically wrong with people in that sense. Like, I don't think people are born with this vast burden of sin. And that seems to be a way to control people, is to tell them that their thoughts are wrong and bad, and they need to listen to someone else's thoughts instead of having their own thoughts.
Yeah, I mean this whole thing is super complicated. You got anything else and before we take another break?
No, I think I'm good.
All right, so we're gonna take a break, and then when we come back, I'm gonna start talking about Council Member Kashama Sawant.
Poet Wrestling with Blood Falling Silent by Rosebud Ben Ani. You could vanish, and Abba says, yes, time to leave. Rarely now does he cant and don Teflon. No temple to dovetail in an emergency, and still both believe the same reveal. Mama cursing the cures that never stick, not unlike magician's wax. It's how a single disease communicates by disassembling the host slowly, gaff and gasp, sawing in half until a debt of miracle snaps or falls flat like cement without pomp and casket. It's when you're too close to the actual act of magic, accidental exposure, that the cool flash of covenants shudder. What are you now, not child? You'll owe the universe everything for this trick that like a virus attaches only to wipe you clean. Is this why blood falls silent when it's a matter of you or me? Or why deep space is accelerating further to rely on a sacred scarcity, and love is already the wraith of dark matter separating planets that will have no one anyway, not even dust or the most patient of rain? Father, mother, I'm sorry it took a global crisis to let your love skid and flourish, leaving so little space for a mask of skinned rabbit. Ghost count of wild cards shed from torn sleeve. Which part gave me away first, the tremors in my hand or the numb and limp and my leaning against the walls you'll restore until dense, until nothing can get in? Was it when I had to confess I could die just like you? High risk if I went back to the only city I ever loved but can no longer keep me safe and breathing? It took me a moment to look into me without light in your eyes and say, "So you want to take us with you?" At first I misunderstood, reveling in this, the only pure thing to be left whole and wilting. It took a little while for the other so calmly to agree. "It's time to get out. It's time for you to leave our place." How long did it sleep? How survival instinct outweighs a house of prayer that was never dealt for all of us. Us three silences in a spun of wool, slip of ram's eye pleading in thicket, wet coal and dry brush amid the wicked. How I am now without past or bond or dream. How the light inside the temple mocks me.
I'm going to talk about Kashama Sawant. She's a Seattle City Council member. She's an interesting character in the background of all of this CHAZ CHOP stuff. Ethan, have you heard much about her?
I heard her name a couple times, but I don't know much about her background or much about her specific role.
Okay, cool. So I'll be reading some quotes from her, and I'll get right into it. Kashama Sawant is a member of the Socialist Alternative Party, which is a party in the United States which promotes a Trotskyite understanding of Marxism. And she's one of the, I think she might be the only like open Marxist who is sitting on any sort of city government anywhere in the nation. And she was very active in the background of all of this CHAZ CHOP stuff. She was very supportive of it, and she was highly critical of Mayor Durkin. She thought that she completely mismanaged the response to the protest, and Sawant said, "If Mayor Durkin refuses to step aside, it will be the responsibility of the city council to remove her by introducing articles of impeachment." So pretty extreme stance on what Mayor Durkin did. Even though she was, she's the one who gave the order to relinquish the East Precinct. She signed in executive orders during this time to ban chokeholds. She signed in emergency 30-day bans on using tear gas. So she was definitely trying to de-escalate stuff, but Sawant did not think it was enough. So she, on June 11th, this is before any of the violence, Sawant tweeted in a 3-part tweet saying that the movement, led by a multiracial community of youth, won a major victory, forcing Seattle police and the big business-backed establishment to leave East Precinct. The movement was undaunted in the face of horrific violence from Mayor Durkin's police. Congratulations, solidarity. Our movement needs to urgently ensure East Precinct is not handed back to police, but is turned over permanently into community control. My office is bringing legislation to convert East Precinct into a community center for restorative justice. The process for deciding East Precinct's conversion must include those involved in CHAZ, Black community organizers, restorative justice, faith, anti-racist, renter organizations, land trust, groups, labor unions that have a proven record of fighting racism. So she is highly supportive of CHAZ, and she did a number of interesting things in the background that weren't necessarily connected to CHAZ. So on June 10th, in the midst of the protests, in the midst of CHAZ going on, Sawant led a group of 1,000 protesters to City Hall, which had been locked down and closed because of coronavirus. She led them to City Hall, unlocked the doors for them, encouraged them all to enter. Sawant and others spoke for about an hour about the needs to defund the police, ban chemical weapons, and the resignation of Mayor Durkin. This is before any of the violence happens. But once the violence starts happening in CHOP, Sawant's initial appraisal of the situation was that it must be extreme right-wingers. This has not been confirmed in the slightest, and she walked the claims back later. And then after the incident on the 29th, which was the death of the 14-year-old, she said, "This highlights the urgency to address the endemic violence in our society under capitalism. Violence was happening on Capitol Hill and in other parts of the city long before the CHOP occupation was created by the movement, and we should completely reject the false claims that have no basis in statistical analysis that the CHOP occupation and the movement was the reason for any of the violence. So yeah, what's your take on that? Because you did the math for us right now on air. And the Seattle Times gave out some data after providing that quote in the paper where they said that there were 3 homicides in 2019 on Capitol Hill, 2 in Cal Anderson Park, but they were months apart. And these were the first homicides to occur in the area all year. So,
Well, also as a Trotskyist, whatever, she would advocate for some form of continual revolution, international and domestic, right? You have to have a constant workers' revolution to keep capitalist oppression at bay. So this would be her dream, right? A state of constant anarchy and violence, right? That eventually destabilizes the capitalist factory owner power.
yeah, and she's she seems like a particularly powerful woman. She's got a kind of a cult of personality building around her, and I don't know. She on the 28th. So this is before the 14-year-old is killed. The night before, Sawant participated in a protest march, which was in the mayor's neighborhood. She wasn't leading the march, but she participated in it, and the protesters went to the mayor's house and vandalized and spray painted the mayor's house on the 28th of June. All of this has led the mayor to request that Sawant be investigated for contemptuous behavior. So she was already actually under investigation by the city council for misusing the council office to promote ballot initiatives, which I guess is a big no-no. And if you don't mind, I'd like to read some of the things that the mayor is requesting that the council investigate Sawant for.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so this is going to take a little bit. This letter requests that the council exercises its charter duties and fully investigate Councilmember Kashama Sawant and determine if action should be taken for the following: relinquishing authority of her office and disregarding city employment and hiring rules. In Councilmember Sawant's case, the media has uncovered documents suggesting that she may have effectively delegated decisions regarding hiring and termination of city employees to an outside political organization. According to the documents, the National Executive Committee and the Seattle Executive Committee of the Socialist Alternative Party had authority over staffing decisions for the city council office. At least one employee was allegedly fired as the result of a decision of the executive committee of this political organization, and that employee protested the firing was the result of political retaliation. 2. Using her official office and equipment to promote and raise money for a ballot initiative or other electioneering, and for failing to comply with public disclosure of all funds raised and spent in those activities, including a website registered to her husband and promoted by Councilmember Sawant. While the SEEC and possibly the PDC continues to investigate, I believe it is imperative that council conduct its own inquiry. This is important for public confidence and because it can also impact council's work on proposed related revenue ordinances pending before council, and as one is explicitly tied to the proposed ballot initiative. 3. Using her official position, gave access to city facilities to admit hundreds of individuals at night into City Hall when it was closed to the public because of COVID-19, and failing to follow the city's COVID-19 precautions for the visitors. Her actions put the safety of the individuals and city workers at risk and led to janitorial staff making complaints about the incident because of safety concerns. 4. Using her official position and possibly staff to encourage attendance at a rally she led on June 28, 2020, to illegally occupy city property, the East Precinct, at a time the city has been trying to de-escalate the situation and asks individuals to depart because of violence in the area. Days earlier, members of the Black community had asked that this facility be restored as an active police facility, particularly in light of the fact that it was created at the request of the Black community by actions of former council member Sam Smith to serve the Central District. We have had a series of devastating gun violence around this location, including early yesterday morning on Capitol Hill, and 5, using her official position to lead a march to my home despite the fact that it was publicly known I was not there, and she and organizers knew that my address was protected under the state confidentiality program because of threats against me due largely to my work as U.S. Attorney. All of us have joined hundreds of demonstrations across the city, but Councilmember Sawant and her followers choose to do so with reckless disregard of the safety of my family and children. In addition, during or after Councilmember Sawant's speech at the rally, her followers vandalized my home by spray painting obscenities. So this lady is a very interesting character, and I'm curious what you have to make about all these allegations and charges against her.
Well, I think some of them are probably exaggerated because of her various political leanings and agitation, right? So if anyone is too radical, someone's going to come along and accuse them of being basically too radical. But to some extent, misusing her power to advance her agenda and especially unsafe gatherings under Corona and COVID lockdowns, that seems to be a particularly important thing, especially just for pure optics. If you have a Marxist community or a council member going around creating COVID outbreaks in an attempt to advance some political agenda, this is going to hurt the overall cause of getting conservatives on board with wearing masks and taking Corona seriously. And people are going to say, hey, she had a little rally here and everyone gets mad. When Trump has a rally, this Corona thing might be bullshit. So I do think there is something to be said about her misusing her power.
Yeah. So she was originally the charge against her for misusing her office to promote ballot initiatives. That was supposed to take place around May 20th. So that was when the ethics committee was supposed to convene and discuss, what was supposed to happen to her. As far as I can tell, that meeting never happened. I'm not sure why. Probably has something to do with all of this unrest, but this was before all of that. So it's just really interesting that there is a very this woman was highly encouraging of CHAZ, and she saw it as a really good thing. And it was interesting just that these CHAZ people kind of had a man on the inside, so to speak.
Yeah, and especially for anarchist sort of activism to be connected to the halls of power fairly directly. Yeah, I don't know. It's definitely an unusual thing. I think it's kind of indicative of this there's almost like a professional class proletariat revolt going on, right? A lot of these people who are deeply invested in these anti-racist activist stuff are kind of like managers or tech people or music producers, right? Like it's not that they're like the lumpen proletariat coming out from the mines to take money away from the capitalists. And there are these like, I don't know. I think that the whole Trotskyism thing, sure, there's nothing wrong with believing it, but it's kind of a goofy, silly, like college thing to believe when you're like 22. And so to have like this loopy sort of Trotskyist council member going around and supporting what turned into a violent homeless camp, that just makes the entire left look like hooligans and fools. And
Right.
she's then, especially when there's again allegations of misusing your office, the power of your office. When anybody does that, it looks bad for the people on your side. And I think that there is kind of playing when you believe in the total moral justness of your cause, you start to play fast and loose with the rules. And you're like, well, I'm on the right side of history, so who cares if I maybe violate a couple little Seattle bylaws here or there.
Right. And in one of her speeches, I believe it was the one near the mayor's home, she quotes Malcolm X Malcolm X has lots of very interesting and insightful things to say about what happened in the United States, and he's not. I don't think he's to be completely disregarded, but she did um, take out, in her speech, she was quoting Malcolm X and said, by any means necessary, right? And it's when that sort of thinking starts to happen, that's when I get worried because, I don't think that, I think that the means of how you do things are oftentimes more important than the ends to which you are attempting to achieve.
Yeah, I think that by any means necessary is a very, very dangerous line of thinking, unless you're really at some sort of last stand of fighting for your life in a immediate sense, because that essentially is the opposite of democracy, right? Democracy is try to persuade people to come to our side, and if they don't and don't agree with us, we don't try to control them via force. But by any means necessary is no matter what happens, we're going to try and achieve our goals, even if that means it comes to violence. And I don't think that it necessarily means violence, but that type of thinking it creates a downward spiral very quickly. And if you say, "Hey, defund the police," and they don't defund the police, what are the means that are necessary then? Clearly, it has to be something more forceful, and that escalates and escalates. And it seems like it did escalate here very quickly because they brought in guns right away. They had
Oh
armed
yeah, almost
guards.
immediately.
And do you think they had the ability to do background checks on people? Like they those like white pages services you can pay for to get someone's criminal record. Do you think they did any of those?
I would highly doubt it. I haven't found evidence either way, but
Yeah.
just
Do you think
just
they banned chokeholds?
well, they didn't even ban shooting into moving vehicles, right?
Yeah, the NYPD did that. So
Uh,
then that's another thing is that they there's movement started because young or not well I don't know if he's not young but George Floyd was killed by a white person, and for all we know the person who fired the bullets and killed the young 14-year-old boy was white. It doesn't really matter what the race was, but he was killed by people who at the end of the day were trying to avenge the death of someone else. So it just seems to be a very fruitless endeavor, and kind of like Occupy, it seems like it's going to take a lot of the punch out of the movement. Maybe not nationally, but at least in Seattle, I think people are going to think twice next time there's a protest.
oh yeah, I would imagine so, right? This is something that can't you can't easily brush this off, I think, unless you are a true believer in the cause, right? Maybe a true believer isn't going to necessarily reconsider things if you've already adopted this mindset of any means necessary. But in terms of the more moderate people, I think it's done great damage to what could be the possibility of real police reform, and that's what Andre Taylor was talking about. He said that this was a missed opportunity where people are only going to remember the two young black men who were killed by the people who were saying that we want young black men to stop dying.
Yeah, if that's not a failure, I don't know what is. Um,
Yeah, yeah, and the first one, I mean, this is just the second one, the 14-year-old, that's sad enough. He came from out of town and, he never comes home. And the first one, the 19-year-old, he literally graduated the day before he died. These are young kids who are about to start their lives and they're full of potential and they're gunned down in this totally misguided, form of protest. And, I don't know. It's really sad.
yeah, but I think that is almost inevitable when you have anarchist movement like this, and the idea that they took control of the streets, and they're just the very like words they were using right from the beginning. There's an aggressive mindset, and also somebody in one of the articles I read we'll post all of them on the website. He said something along the lines of free thinking people do drugs, and this attracted free thinking people, and that might have also attracted an outside element of drug dealers. I think that's very true. If you have a group of people who are generally lawless and don't like following authority, that would be a pretty good place to peddle some drugs.
Oh
And
yeah, I saw
people who
video.
sell drugs have a lot of money. Lots of cash and drugs leads to guns and violence.
Yeah, and this is something that Andre Taylor talked about, and he said that he made a couple of speeches within the CHAZ zone before the violence happened, and he was talking about how much change had already occurred to policing in Seattle, and he said that most of the people looked at him with sort of blank stares. And he realized while talking to other people in his organization and lots of CHAZ people that most of the people who were participating in this, as far as Andre Taylor could tell, were from outside of the city of Seattle and outside of the state of Washington. And this is, I think, this is kind of a really um, dangerous thing, and this seems dangerous in one sense. I understand wanting to go across state lines to protest, right? But I don't. This is also one of my issues with some sort of top-down ideology like Marxism is it doesn't take into account local concerns and what's happening locally. So then all of a sudden you have a bunch of people who are, they're Americans, but they're essentially foreigners to Seattle. Seattle has a very particular culture, and it has a particular history of whatever policies are in place. And these people are ignorant of that. And instead, they're just there, and it ends up causing chaos and trouble. Um, and I think it was a really sort of it was a tough realization for Andre Taylor when he's talking about it. I'll put a post. We'll post a link to the video where he talks about this. But I think as far as he's concerned, he said he wishes that this energy could have been put to reform that was actually going to work. And I think he's really worried that this is going to undo a lot of the work he's fought for.
Yeah, and people who were doing the work before that led to the police reforms. Obviously, if you're not from Seattle and you go there, you probably don't know as much about reforms that already happened. So you're just calling for endless reform, which is also what the Trotskyites want. But, well, actually, they don't want reform, they want constant revolution. But constant reform is revolution. And when, they have done certain reforms and people don't pay attention to it, that also deepens the divide between people inside the police who are open to reform and are trying to fix things. And so, you've tried to fix things and pass certain laws, and if you're a quote-unquote good cop and you've been going along with these reforms, you probably had to do extra things in the meantime, and then people turn around and sometimes literally spit in your face. You're not going to be as interested in reform anymore.
Right. And I think that there's an idea amongst particularly young people that being able to change the system should be a quick and easy thing. And I'm starting to think the opposite, right? I'm starting to think that, well, not necessarily opposite, but I'm starting to understand why it's a good thing that things shouldn't be easily changeable, right? It does require work. You actually have to think about this stuff. So if you want to be able to implement reforms in a kind of willy-nilly fashion, like very quickly, without thinking about all of the consequences, then yeah, I'm glad for the checks and balances in our system, and I think that people would be served much better if they actually figured out how local governments worked and did the um, did the due diligence of learning about their local system and affecting change in that way rather than just going out and screaming with a sign in their hand, thinking that that's going to solve the problem.
I think it goes back to the meme culture too, where to these people who are shouting and screaming and screeching for various changes, they really think it's very, very simple. Like, oh, we just need to raise the minimum wage and make or make healthcare free. Okay, even if you believe that healthcare should be entirely free, you still have a lot of different kinks, and it has to be implemented somehow. You actually have to make this a law and write. There's going to be thousands of pages of writing and arguments back and forth about what's the best way to make healthcare free. What's the best form of universal healthcare? How are we going to get medication to people who need it the most? How are we going to prioritize need, etc. And they just really think that it's as simple as, oh, if this congressman saw the same memes I did, if they got educated and got woke, which most of the time means that you read a couple Facebook posts and read some literature that your HR director gave you after they caught you, telling an offensive joke. Um, it's just utterly simplistic, and there's not a lot of thought that goes into it, and so it's no wonder that people don't understand the complicated various reform. Like, there was a election commissioner who came to speak at Bard one time, and he was talking about the reason why uh, like the voter rolls are expunged sometimes is because you need an accurate count of the people in a given area in order to know where to put polling zones. And there's certain rules related to where to put polling sites that are almost, maybe not outdated, but seem goofy. Like, you have to be able to clearly see the building from various distances, so it can't be hidden, in some back alley somewhere. And so there's a reason why sometimes people's names are taken off the voting rolls other than voter suppression. And if you
Right.
wanted to make a polling site more accessible, you'd actually have to understand all the complicated rules that go into designating a place a polling site. What was common for students to say is that the Republicans control where the polling sites go and they don't want students voting. Part of that's probably true. You don't generally want a bunch of young college students voting in your district if you're a Republican. But there's more to it than that. And if you want to actually fix it instead of just be annoyed by it, you're going to have to actually understand the entire deeper issue. And it doesn't seem that the people who started CHOP understood the larger, deeper issue of what was wrong with Seattle. They didn't actually come up with anything close to a viable solution for homelessness or fixing schools. They just cost the city a lot of money and killed 2 people.
Right. And wounded 3 others.
Especially when there's a pandemic going on.
I used to live in Washington State. I actually grew up there, and I was
Oh, I'm
talking.
sorry.
I was talking to a friend of mine, a lifelong friend. I've known this guy since I was like 3 years old, and he was telling me, I haven't been able to verify this independently, but I trust him. And he told me he saw on the local news that there was someone from the city government. He's pretty sure it was the mayor, said, we hear your, she said something along the lines of, we hear what you're upset about. We're working on fixing the problem with policing, but you need to realize it's not going to be fixed overnight. And my friend was astounded when the crowd booed her for that. They were upset that the problem with policing wasn't going to be able to be fixed overnight. And there is whatever group of people makes this mob up, they might not think that way if you're trying to have a reasonable conversation with them outside of the mob setting. But for whatever reason, this version of the mob does not seem to understand that time is a necessity. It's like they all forgot the old adage that Rome wasn't built in a day. And I think
Well, that's because it was old white men who built Rome, Raj. If they had more melanin, they would have built it in a couple hours.
I think that this whole conversation warrants bringing up those Arendt quotes that we talked about in episode 0. I'm going to remind the audience of what my quote was, and I think, Ethan, you should do the same. Every generation, civilization is invaded by barbarians. We call them children. Ethan, you got yours?
I don't have it right in front of me, but it was paraphrasing the idea that education will simply solve all of the problems with society. That the idea that people simply need to be educated a little bit better is a foolish and dangerous idea.
And that education, I think also within that quote is the notion that the proper process of educating will continue in perpetuity, when Arendt seems to suggest that that's not the case.
Yeah.
But yeah, anything else, or should we go ahead and close up?
I think that's pretty good for today. We covered a lot of stuff about the CHAZ CHOP zone. Overall, I'm gonna call it a failure. Honestly, I think it was a bunch of people who had mostly good intentions at first, but they just don't actually have any idea what they're talking about. And to be quite honest, a bunch of hippie artist type people, they're not bad people. There's definitely a lot of good things they can do, but taking over a small section of the city and running a government does not seem like their type of thing, right?
It's not
Like
their
you would
forte.
not, yeah. And honestly, I think it's kind of indicative of a certain class of people who are upper middle class white gentrifiers, essentially, is what the progressive left would call them, even. And they make up a big part of the progressive left, and they don't like themselves, and they constantly talk about how much they don't like white people, but they're the ones who are actually causing a lot of these problems and driving up housing prices. And they all want to live in metro areas of cities, and next to all the other liberals, and they're mad at when the electoral college doesn't swing their way, right? Everyone wants to live in a certain area of Seattle, and then they are so confused about why there's homeless people. Oh, because maybe you took their houses and drove up the real estate prices. I think that is not disconnected from the fact that this whole CHOP CHAZ thing ended up in killing people.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to agree with you. This seems like a blatant failure, and I hope that the progressive left learns from this and doesn't repeat this mistake, because it's a deadly mistake, and I'd hate to see it repeated on a larger scale.
And also, if this was a group of evangelical Christians who decided to take over a part of, I don't know, Provo, Utah, and make it a ethno state for evangelical Christians, and polygamy is completely legal, etc. The whole 9 yards of what the worst ills of right wing religion, right wing religious extremism. People would immediately say, "Hey, that's not right. You can't do that. Like, you can't just secede from the country."
Oh, the left
Like,
would be the first to call it out.
yeah, and the idea that you would secede from the United States, or even like make your own little private autonomous zone, they might as well be waving a Confederate flag. Instead of trying to fix any problem, you're like, "Oh, this is my area of town now, and I'm not going to let the cops in."
Yeah. Yep.
Childish.
Childish indeed.
We were thinking about doing the woke or broke label. I'm going to say broke for sure. Definitely not woke.
Yeah. CHAZ, broke, not woke. All right, guys. Well, let's see. Oh, the next episode, I guess we'll tease it. We'll be talking to next week. We'll be talking to Paul Vanderklay. Paul is the pastor for a Sacramento Christian Reformed church, Calvinist church, and he does a lot of thinking online. He's got a YouTube channel himself. It's Paul Vanderklay. And I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I've talked to him a few times, and this will be the first time he and Ethan will be speaking with one another. I think it's going to be a great conversation, and everyone should tune in.
Yeah, it's going to be a lot of fun. We're going to get back into the swing of things with interviews, and yeah, I've never met Paul Vanderklay, so it'll be interesting to talk to him for the first time. I think we're going to do video too, right?
Yeah, that's the plan.
Is there any, like, let's say could I wear like a Yankees jersey? Is there any law against that?
I don't think so, but look into it.
I guess I could do some research. I'm starting to like this. I'm starting to like this leftist, no research, no thinking thing. It's pretty easy, right?
It is
Like,
definitely an
illegal?
easy
Oh, it
way to
doesn't
go
matter.
about life.
Yeah. Can I use this image? Oh, who cares? It's just a capitalist anyway.
Right. Right. Intellectual property is a capitalist scam.
Yeah. Another
All right.
way to white man keeps us down.
We'll see you guys next week.
Savior in ourselves will crumble the walls. I know it seems a bit like we came from outer space, but Betty knows I waited, saw the alien, okay. Chalk it up to destiny, the rest of me's you, like a pretty little rabbit chilling on the moon. I won't break the arcade game before the flash that makes the black heart taste the lash. I won't disclose the future except for what I know. Tell the radio and television to tell the show. I saw the alien, okay, okay. I saw the peace sign, November break of day. I saw the alien, okay, okay. Shining in the sky, November break of day. The dead endeavor, happiest rabbit ever. Within the cosmic blessing of love and energy. Drums to space, you know this is the place. Our heart and soul has saved the human race. Could it be that we truly know the score? 'Cause my alien friends say we ended the war. A bloody battle, an interstellar fight. Somehow we did it, victory of the light. But I won't break the arcade game before the flash that makes the black heart taste the lash. I won't disclose the future except for what I know. Tell the radio and television to tell the show. I saw the alien, okay, okay. I saw the peace sign, remember break of day. I saw the alien, okay, okay. Shining in the sky, November break of day. Can you break the arcade game before the flash? The flash that makes the dark star crash in the grass. I won't disclose the future except for what I know. Tell the radio and television to tell the show. I saw the alien, okay, okay. I saw the peace sign, November break of day. I saw the alien, okay, okay. Shining in the sky, November break of day. I saw the alien, okay, okay. I saw the peace sign too, okay. I saw the alien, okay, okay. Shining in the sky, November break of day.